I had a June date in Texas to do a live in-person presentation. They asked if I would come in person because they've rented a 1,000-seat auditorium and they have 200 teachers. So they're going to do social distancing and have it in person.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Interesting.
That is very interesting, that a way to come back. I'm thinking that, I think that's what schools, I think people are understanding it's going to be with us for a while. So the thing is, how do you deal with it and adapt it? So that's the first time we've had that happen, where people have actually asked for an in-person and they're going to socially distance the group.
My impression is that whether you're in school or business, you really can't make solid plans past a month. Everything else is tentative.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hi, Sid. Yes, we can.
Good morning.
Welcome.
Thank you. It's good to see all of you.
You too. And what's the status in California right now?
A lot of confusion, a lot of mixed messages. And so one at the county level, in my particular county yesterday, at the Board of Supervisors meeting, they announced that they're looking about an $8 million shortfall. And so I have contracts with the county of San Bernardino. Concerning. At the state level, they're looking at starting to allow some rollout of businesses opening. But the school districts themselves, the conversations I've been having is they don't plan on going back at the July date that's being suggested.
Ruby, can you hear me?
Yes.
With the schedules, and then also looking at some distance learning. And a lot of them don't have the infrastructure for that, so they need to prepare for that.
And how much did you say the shortfall was going to be in San Bernardino County?
Right now it's projected at 80 million, zero.
Say that again?
80 million.
Ah. Okay.
And so they're looking at what they can do as far as budget cuts, efficiencies, and stuff like that. And one of those is contracts and MOUs that they have with other organizations. That's a category where I would fall under.
Yeah.
About 2 million in contracts. And so so it's daily conversations with my contacts over there and seeing what we do. And we serve only the county of San Bernardino, and specifically those kids and families that are being case managed. So caseworkers, social workers, probation officers, and things like that. And we, of course, have seen an increase in the need for everything, and also an increase in the reporting of abuse.
This is Ruth Wyrick, and we're going to ask you to turn on your cameras if you would like. We're going to also ask you to mute your microphones when you aren't speaking, and we're going to get started. So here you go, Ruby.
Well, first of all, everyone who's on, thank you so much. And it's so wonderful to have contact via Zoom. We wanted to talk this time about, this is just an open chat, but we wanted to talk about diversity issues and special populations, particularly immigrant populations and what that means, and particularly diversity, students of color, what that means. So I've asked Dr. Cheston Ozine Curl to be a part of this, talk about this, and also Ruben Perez. So I think I'd like to, one of my questions I'd like to start with is, what will be the impact of COVID on students of color, and what can we do about that? So Cheston, do you mind starting that conversation?
Sure. I was talking with Ruben about this a little earlier. There's an adage in the African American community that says, when white America gets a cold, Black folks get pneumonia. And I think that's kind of what we are seeing with the numbers that are being reported from the states. And I think the question then is really the why of that. We have to reflect a little bit on the why of the high concentrations among communities of color and also the quick spread. So there are about 3 things that I'm witnessing experientially, as well as what the research says about communities of color and healthcare that I'd like to touch on really quickly. The first one is that we have this distrust sometimes in communities of color for healthcare systems, whether that's related to historically things like the Tuskegee experiment or modern research on African American women and high fatality rates going in for birthing. So sometimes in African American communities, high Latin populations, we just don't want to go out into the system. And there's not a single story for communities of color. So sometimes we have people in communities of color that are better resourced in several areas, and we have the other end of the spectrum where we may need more resources. That's not a unique thing, is that this is all on a spectrum. But generally speaking, there's this historic fear of going in. So we know if we want to handle it at home, we want to treat it at home, but by then we may have infected somebody else. So the community spread and the numbers that we're seeing in places like Chicago, where there is a 50% African American population, but 79% of the deaths, the COVID deaths, are African American. That's there that we look at the epigenetic transfer of trauma and predisposition to certain chronic illnesses like cardiovascular disease and respiratory disease and asthma also influence the severity of the cases of COVID in communities of color. And those things we could spend a whole session on, how structurally we've got areas like Flint and high exposure to lead and other heavy metals that cause some of these health issues that are transferred throughout the generations and make the infection more difficult to fend off. There's also, when we think about a little equity walk through education, Brown versus the Board of Education wasn't that long ago. My father reminds me of that because he was born in 1954. So when we take that into account, as a millennial, I am the first generation in my family that did not attend a segregated school at any point in time in my life. And I think when you're outside of the community of color and don't realize things like that, it seems very far away to say things like segregation and struggle. But I remember being in an early framework training with Ruby, and she mentioned first generation college students choose service industries or social service industries. We're in healthcare, we're in education and things like that. So when you scope the community in this equity walk through education, we've got a lot of people in communities of color who are working in those industries where they're at a higher rate of exposure. They're on the front lines as nurses. A lot of teachers are doing this Zoom thing or hybrid, but I still have several teachers who work in high minority districts that are going in daily. The teachers are going in daily to the building. Some in Houston, the APs. And so when you take those things into consideration, we kind of see where the higher rate of exposure and infection is, and then why sometimes it can increase. And the second part of what you asked was about what we can do, Ruby, and I think it is honoring that there is not a single story. I think back to emotional poverty, and when we integrate, there's a high likelihood that it will be hybrid or all virtual or something crazy that we haven't even dreamt up yet. But when fall rolls around, it's not going to be business as usual. We know at least that much. So we have to start thinking about things like visual storyboards. Those things we can incorporate, and they are expressive but not invasive. I may not have the words as a child to express what I've been experiencing, especially if I am a child of color and there's a higher rate in my community. That means there's also obviously a higher rate that there could be someone related to me in my household, in my community that has been exposed because of those rates. And so what we don't want to do is be invasive. So using things like the visual storyboard to kind of gain a scope of where these kids are, they're not the kids that teachers have right now. There's a little bit of a benefit in starting the year out and getting this disruption. But what happens when we come back and we're trying to go through those get to know you activities and we have no familiarity with the kids and they don't know us? So we want to do something warm that way. Also consider the use of Zoom, Google Classroom, and Schoology, other systems that you may have that have waiting rooms. Allow kids an opportunity to integrate in small groups so that they feel seen and heard. Integrating into a mass is going to be a little bit difficult, but when we kind of break it into small groups as much as we can, especially for the early synchronous things, and we can look at all the frames on the screen right now and see face and establish relationships that way. The second thing that I would recommend is to avoid downplaying the severity. Most of us are doing okay probably on this webinar by the fact that we're able to get on here and kind of converse. It may not be perfect, but in my own circle, I see people using things like the coronation or the viral break or the extended summer. And so some people, we have to realize that, as Ruben was saying earlier, and I'm going to turn it over to him here, but we are all sort of in the same experience, but we're not all at the same place. So we want to really be careful and check people on your campus if they're using terminology that might downplay the severity of what kids, especially kids of color or in high concentrations of infection, are dealing with on a daily basis. Ruben, before I pass that baton, I want to share a story with everyone. A friend of mine who's also an Afro-Latina mother was talking about the tension that we don't know we spread to our kids in just trying to be careful and just try to stay away from that, don't do this, don't do that. Her son's always had anxiety when storms roll in. Well, the other day, he was a storm hunter for the first time. He had been watching the news. He was so excited that thunderstorms are coming and there could be hail. And she thought, whose kid is this? What are you doing? Storm chasing. Sure enough, when the storm hit, he was at the window and he was watching and he was listening for hail. And he was so excited, he fell asleep by the window. As she started talking to him later on, what she realized was that the storm was something visual, tangible. It was observable. And that the storm of COVID is invisible, just like its effects. And so I thought, let's all slow down and think about that. He's excited about a storm he can see because on a daily basis, he's dealing with things that he can't see.
Very nice story. Thank you. Ruben, you want to pick up and then we'll open it up to questions and comments.
It's hard to follow a great act. That's very comprehensive and incredible. There was something that was said to us in middle school a long time ago that I recently also read in an article, and I love the expression because it kind of pretty much pegs it. The article, I think, is called "We're Not in the Same Boat." And I forgot what we were going through in middle school, and a counselor spoke to our class, and he said, you know, guys, I know we've been saying that everybody's in the same storm. No, we're all in the same boat. He said, we're really not. We're in the same storm, but we are in different boats. And different boats sometimes have different number of lifeboats, different number of equipment, and sometimes one boat is much more well prepared for a storm than another. And that was the first time that I really understood that just because the same stimulus is happening, a different response is also happening. So when it comes to, you know, immigrants, people of color, or anything like that, one of the things that I feel the need to point out is Ruby's original work on a framework for understanding poverty. It's not so much sometimes, let me back up. The difference between cultural diversity and economic diversity gets blended together a lot, and the two get very confusing as to where one begins and the other one ends. But where they overlap, it becomes just part of that reality. So one thing I want to point out is that even though there's more people, more white people in the United States in poverty, they have the least amount of percentage within that population. People of color have a higher percentage of themselves in poverty. Therefore, their own image, their own stereotype of themselves, the way people of color see themselves, they have many more examples of their own color in poverty. So therefore, that becomes an identifier. The other things that a lot of minorities in the United States come from third world countries. And so the basic root of the culture comes from an economic base of a third world culture, even though that's a political term and not an economic term. So when you come to the United States and suddenly there's a poverty, middle class, and wealth, the groups in and of themselves start to define themselves differently because it's a transplanted reality. So even though we're going to talk about people of color and immigrants, we are also talking about the overlap of people in poverty. So I want to just make that as a foundation before I move on. There's been some videos that I've seen in social media where people who've been gathering, there was one of a large congregation during Easter Sunday, there was another one of a picnic, and they were all people of color who were not social distancing. And there were a lot of harsh statements made about those videos from people who are more than likely in middle class or wealth. And one thing I want to say is poverty was probably not social distancing before that Easter Sunday. They needed to not do social distance because they needed to borrow eggs and milk and get a ride. And if somebody's grandmother, they don't want them at the grocery store, then one person is shopping for 5 people. And that's going to be much more common in poverty, where middle class and wealth will have things delivered. So if the issue is poverty and culture, then you have a higher percentage of people of color in poverty that is happening. And so that's just one of those layers. In one of those videos, I found it very interesting that there was a guy filming a very large Easter Sunday gathering, and he's having his own commentary on why his people are not paying attention to social distancing, not following the rules. And he's, off the cuff interviewing. Why do you think we don't, socially distance? Why do you think we don't follow the rules? Why do we don't? And everybody that answered was laughing. And they were saying, and I'm going to warn you, it's an inappropriate, I'll initial, is that because we MFers don't follow the rules. And I immediately thought, you have to not follow the rules to survive. But now you've labeled yourself as a rebel, as an identifier. So part of that identifying who you are and what your group means to you has a lot to do with what your surroundings have taught you to say. So when you have students who come into your classroom, you're not going to change an opinion just because you have a counter belief. So one of the things I want you to be aware of is that kids will come with their own identity and their own stories based upon their own environment. And if we come at them with a counter story, a counter belief, we really don't change opinions. They're still going to go back to their own. So it really doesn't matter if you're white even, because in Appalachia, you're going to have the same kind of things happening. However, people of color are reflected very differently in social media and in other aspects. So it becomes just a grander pattern. The other thing is that you're going to have, because you have a third world country base for a lot of cultures, you're going to have a lot of people practicing alternative medication. Take this tea, take this herb, go to in my culture, it's the curandera, the shaman type thing. So there's going to be a lot of belief that we can save money, save energy by going to alternative means. And we're going to be doing all sorts of other things. So, and that can be very heavily frowned upon when kids go back to school. It's like they'll go into a detail over it, and somebody may say, well, that's silly, and they may not say it with words, but they may say it with their face. So once you get those nonverbals, you learn to be quiet and not say anything. And so when we ask kids to share, the things that were happening already that led up to judgment play a part in what kids learn they're able to share openly and honestly about. So listening in a way that has a much more non-judgment, body language and all, is really going to be critical when we come back. I'm looking at my notes to see if I'm missing anything. So one of the things, Ruby asked us to talk about 2 things we can do when we go back. One big thing is to speak in the we And in the we, allow for the diversity of experiences, allow for the different stories, you know, because in your boat, you experience this, in your boat, you experience this, and one isn't right or wrong. There was an article that came out from, I think it was from Haiti. I think it was from Haiti. And it said that social distancing is a privilege and it's evidence of a privileged life. And that people in other countries cannot socially distance because you don't have everything you need within the house and you can't have everything delivered. So it is from one country to another, we're going to put our lens of what we know and then judge it as right or wrong according to what we think is right and what's supposed to happen. So when we speak in the we, it's not just speaking, it's the listening. And it's the allowability that everybody's boat is different. The other thing is be very careful that when kids come back, well, even now, be careful if you catch yourself operating on pity or scolding. If you feel sorry for children, you're not going to teach them, you're going to try to save them, which is another word for enabling. And if you're scolding, then you're getting mad at the reality that doesn't match your approval. So that's my input.
And before we open up, I want to ask one question. Do you think if your immigrant status is uncertain, would that keep you from getting medical help?
Absolutely, especially on your the legality of your status.
Yes.
And the other thing, before I go into that, I forgot one thing. In the immigrant group, regardless of which group it is, if you've got monolingual, non-English speaking parents, then you've got children who are doing the translations.
Yes.
Okay, so if you have children who are doing the translations, they're probably dealing with a lot of very serious adult issues. And it's not uncommon for a third grader to play the lead in a household of parents who don't speak in English.
But right now, you're not allowed to take your child with you or any other human being in with you into a medical facility.
No, but the child can still feel as if they're supposed to be there. They're in the wrong place if they don't go. So that kid can be experiencing a lot of trauma or a lot of emotional angst because they're not there to save their parent, translate for their parent, or do whatever is expected from the past. Their pattern and their identity has now shifted. You know, so the anxiety could be, dad is going or mom is not going to do well without me.
Yeah, I think across the immigrant populations and other populations that include people of color, the complexity of avoiding a healthcare system is so extensive. And sometimes those of us who are resourced differently, as Ruben was saying, we assume the we instead of build the we with them. In my own family, I know there are people who would love to go to the hospital right now, but for fear of what's happened, because all they can do is go to the emergency room, they don't have insurance. It's like, it's not even worth it. What if I don't have it and I go there and I get exposed? People are putting off normal healthcare issues. And so I think that extends to the immigrant population with I go out and then people are looking at me funny. I've heard things out in the neighborhood. Look at this person over here. Why are they here with me? So there's all the disdain and the normal constraints of experiencing racial and socioeconomic discrimination that are compounded by health implications and can also worsen the health implications, right?
So let's open up to questions and comments. First of all, thank you, Cheston, and thank you, Ruben, so much, and for your comments. And now I'd love to open up to larger questions. So who has a question or a comment?
Hi, Ruby. This is Sid again. One of the things that we're seeing a lot of right now as well is while there is distance learning and school districts, the majority of them have provided devices, there is still very much some inequity in how it's being either distributed, and especially when it comes to the access of Wi-Fi and issues like that. But, you know, one device per family isn't really enough, and especially if you have 4 to 6 kids in that family, and they are now competing then for the access and also the ability to be able to use those devices.
Right. And I saw that in California, a couple school districts decided not to do any distance learning because of the inequity of it. Is that correct?
There have been some that have been doing that. They've then, the district themselves weren't able to do it or decided not to. And then community organizations perhaps have stepped up to fill that need. But I know that us, for example, we've distributed a few hundred devices as well. But again, it's just not enough.
Ruby, this is Bethany.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Bethany.
My apologies. I wanted to echo comments made by both the speakers today in relation to the overlap with race and poverty. If a child lives in a household of extreme poverty, if that child is the first to get sick, then that child is blamed, and that child is made to feel very guilty and feels a great deal of shame, and heaven help that child if he or she has to go to the doctor. Then they are blamed not only for making everybody else sick, but for taking away the family's money.
I have a question. Shauna, you've been taking profuse notes. What have you walked away with? Because you've been writing the whole time.
I have. I do that anyway. I just like to have something to go back to. One of the things that I really picked up on that I like personally is the we. I read that this morning, and using that appropriately, I've found myself thinking about, this is a we, but the we is different all across the board. And so, really using the we in the right way and incorporating that in that. And the boat, we're in that storm, but it looks different for everyone, and everyone's boat is very different, and the we in that is different. And so just kind of taking some of the things, about how students will respond when we go back. And I want to just say about what Sid was saying. Our district gave out devices, but even in the midst of that, we're still seeing students who we're not connecting with. We're not seeing the feedback from the student. We're not seeing them log on or interact in the way that we hope. But those are some things that just the complexity of that whole piece of it, the dynamics of the home. They may have been provided certain things, and they're just still not able to do some of it. So, I'm going to be writing notes. I've only got 4 more minutes until I have to be on another Zoom. So I'm taking it all in. So I appreciate it. This is awesome.
Yeah, and maybe, one thing as school leaders is, in part of that discussion about we, is to kind of already pre-plan so that there's no surprise element. Is how is a staff and as a whole going to respond to students who have not connected to school at all or very little in comparison to those who had very well-resourced homes, because the kids can shame each other among themselves.
Yeah. Something that a superintendent brought up the other day was, we tend to think about it being kids who are less resourced being the ones that are not engaging. But in many cases, as different campuses are taking stock here, it's kids who are also very resourced, and teachers are passing judgment about that, but they may not have a device per person, like you're saying. And if mom's job requires her to be online 8 hours a day, the kid cannot engage because they're sharing a device, or because the bandwidth is running low, and everybody's trying to pull from one system. So I think it's important to keep in mind that there's many reasons across the socioeconomic spectrum as well that may keep kids or limit kids from engaging synchronously. So plan some asynchronous opportunities as well, so that kids can not feel bad that I couldn't make it to this, but I do have the opportunity to contribute this way.
Yeah. You know, one thing that I stressed a lot when I was working with certain teachers is that to discuss the difference between teaching and facilitating. When you're teaching, you're the sage on the stage. When you're facilitating, you're listening and you're letting other people discover. And if you're in pity or scolding, and if you're in teaching versus facilitating, then it's very likely that when kids tell you stories that you find shocking or you don't like to hear what you've heard, that you try to fix what they're thinking, feeling, you try to fix them, as opposed to allow them their reality, and so that they can be in a place where they're safely expressing themselves. So, you know, talking to staff members about not trying to fix what they've experienced, because if you're having a problem with it, careful what comes out of your mouth.
One thing I wanted to bring up, and maybe it'd be a suitable topic for next time, but there's going to be a lot of death in this and a lot of secondary trauma. And one of the things I think that schools are not always very good about doing is, as one of the things I think is that unlike other kind of death, well, there's more death in poverty, period. There's more death in immigrant populations. There's more death in groups of color. The issue is there's more death the less resourced you are. And one of the things I'm wondering is, we as an institution, we are pretty unschooled, unable to deal with what that looks like when it comes into the classroom in the way it's going to come in now. Cheston or Ruben, you have any comments about that?
I think when it, you know, just as a classroom teacher of 14 years and then a district administrator and then a campus administrator, I have discovered that death will always be talked about differently from one person to the next, depending on their comfort level of it, their belief system, and their ability to allow the student to have their own reality. Because sometimes people go into preaching, sometimes they go into teaching, sometimes they say dismiss it happened 10 years ago. You know, everybody has their own opinion about something that personal. And it really affects what comes out. So that could be something else that a staff discusses about, you know, as a staff, how do we discuss it? Because now we have something that has normalized the experience for a lot of people worldwide. And so what is our approved response? You know,
well, I was just thinking about, if I'm an elementary kid and I've watched newsreel after newsreel after newsreel of people loaded on stretchers dead, that has got to impact me.
Yeah. As an educator, I don't think we've ever had a death conversation or training to talk about. So it's left to your own recognizance. Cheston, I'm sorry.
No, I agree. I was thinking about processing so many things that you said earlier, Ruben. You've had so many wonderful points here about, building the we collective. It's all things are a new normal in the midst of this, but remembering to build what that we and what that new normal looks like, respecting it and not trying to be the savior. Grief is so complex. Even in my own family, I think about when we lose a family member, how we all react differently, and to respect that. Try to avoid being the savior teacher that says, I'm going to plan this beautiful assignment where you get to write about your feelings and get the grief out that way. Well, that might work for you, but the kid might be somebody who that would lance something and spark an emotional response that you're not prepared to deal with. So I keep thinking about all the nonverbal activities and movement-based activity that we can incorporate into our assignments for coming back out to work through some of the stress. Because when we're not ready to be verbal and someone asks us to be verbal, we ain't gonna like the verbal that they get, right? So, it's like lighting a fuse. So I think that going into some specific secondary traumatic stress training And reading about grief counseling while understanding that we're not certified grief counselors is going to help inform how we process things and help us respect the lenses that kids might be bringing to class.
Sid says in the chat box, he's seen students that go to school the day after a parent has passed away. And they were just thinking compassion and grief support, not from the family, which reminded me of when I was a principal. One morning at 7 a.m., this father is calling me from his car, and he says, look, I have this 6th grader with me, and his dad was killed in a car accident last night about 2 a.m. He said, they're our next door neighbors. And he insisted on coming to school this morning. He was insistent on it. He said, and now he won't get out of the car. And he said, I have to go to work. So I said to the father, look, he's just trying to find one place in his life that's still the same. Okay, he knows his life is totally changed. So I went out to the car, got the kid, and brought him in, and I said, look, I know you want to be at school today, and we're glad to have you. It's a lot to process, and whenever you decide that you want to leave, if you need to leave, just come see me, and we'll make that happen. But I thought he needed one place that was normal. Yeah, and Sue Nell says the trauma fatigue as well. That's a lot. So maybe I don't have a topic for our next Zoom meeting next week, but maybe what a good topic would be is how to deal with how to work with students in the with grief and death, what that might look like. So Ruben likes that, and Jeffrey likes that, and comments from anybody else. And anybody have somebody to suggest who would be really good at that?
Can I ask a question really quickly? And I might have missed it. And I'm in Arkansas, by the way. I'm in Northwest Arkansas, so, but I came on late, so I might have missed this. But I was looking back at some of the material that you posted or that you shared with us about questions to ask the kids to check on them. And you had mentioned to look at their eyes, and you said, ask them to look at the ceiling and can they do this? And then how does their expression change? Can you tell me what I should be looking for? When I Zoom with my kids, and I've noticed it more so recently, there are times when it's been really great because the kids who would not typically reach out to get help have done that. But I'm noticing now a shift in my kids and their demeanor. And I have one child in particular that I'm thinking of. He looks so sad. And when I'm looking at him and I'll ask him questions, he'll participate. He's pretty quiet unless I ask him questions. And he just sits there like this. And he just looks so pitiful and sad. And so I thought maybe my next Zoom, and I talked to the kids this morning, that I would share, I would have them on a piece of paper. I would ask some of the questions that you posted to ask, and have them write it down for me. And then maybe I could snap a picture so I can reflect on it later.
Have them give you visuals.
Yes.
And what I like to move them to is that when you're going through stress and resiliency, the research is to pull through it. You almost always have to have some sort of longer range goal, okay? You have to be able to see or envision a future or a contribution or a goal. Recently, I read a lot, and I read this book by a guy named Barker called Barking Up the Wrong Tree. Everything you know about success is wrong. And one of the things he said in that is that, and even now this was with adults, but an even more important question to ask them than their visual story. What we like to make them that visual storyboard, you know, what do you want to do for your head?
Yes.
But he said an even more question is, when you, at the end of your life, what do you want to be remembered for? Okay. He said that seems to be a more even driving force than your visual story. But what do you want to be remembered for? And I think that what I have noticed that for me personally, and then if you look at the people who've gone through unbelievable trauma, like the guy, the one who was in the concentration camp and wrote the book, Viktor Frankl, he said you can handle anything if you know the why, if you know why you're alive. And so one of the things I like to look at is, what's a contribution you would like to make in your lifetime to make people's lives better? How would you go about doing that? Can you draw some pictures for me about what that might look like? So the other thing I'm going to recommend to you that reduces anxiety, and then we'll be done, but I should show this next time. One of the things you can do to reduce anxiety is do a kaleidoscope video with kids online. I don't know if you've seen kaleidoscope videos, and what I'll do is I'll show one next time. But kaleidoscope videos, when you watch a kaleidoscope, what it does, for whatever reason, it disengages your conscious, and you relax, and all those what if and anxiety questions that people ask, it's harder for you to access them. And so what you do is you ask them to think about something, a picture of something in the future they would like to have. And then they watch this kaleidoscope video for about 8 minutes. And I've done it before, and it's very relaxing. There's an app you can get on your phone. It's called Kaleidoscope, and you can make a kaleidoscope out of anything. And then you just record your video, okay, and you make it available, all right? And so one of the things that I would suggest is a combination of those things. It helps reduce anxiety. You're pulling them to a different future. And then I tell them your eyes have to be up for you to see that. That's where your brain neurologically processes visuals. So you have to go up. So sometimes they'll talk. If you just say to them, I want you to put a picture on the ceiling and tell me just a little bit about that picture. And so while their eyes are up like that, it's not actually possible for the brain to access emotion. So it's another calming thing. But next time we talk, I'll show you all that kaleidoscope video. It's amazing.
That would be great. Thank you.
Yeah. All right, so we're on for next time. Let me ask, does anyone know a person we might invite on who knows a lot about grief or grief counseling? Particularly, anybody? I have a friend who's a psychologist.
I know somebody, Ruby. I'll talk to you about it.
Okay, all right. Anybody else? And this is recorded, so you all can go back over the recording. And again, Cheston and Ruben, thank you. What you both of you said was just phenomenal. Let's give you both a big round of applause.
Thank you.